Hello, networkers, and welcome back to another episode of Ask the Network Engineer, where I will answer one of your questions. In this episode, I want to talk about learning about new products, hardware, and deploying them in your production environment. And this question actually came from Adrian, and he basically talks about that we all come across a piece of hardware that we never worked with before in our lives, like UCS, Nexus, Fabric Interconnects, things like that. And the company that we work for expects us to get that equipment up and running. Can you tell us about a time that this happened to you? How did you familiarize yourself with the gear? And how did you learn to configure the device? And how did you integrate the new piece of equipment into the existing environment? It's a great question, so I'm going to talk about that and other things in this episode. Okay, so there's a lot of different ideas that I have about this, and of course, my own stories. And I think the best place to really start is the method of learning that you prefer and that you prevail at. And I talked about this a lot in another episode about there are people that prefer classroom learning and self-learning. And those are really big things because they do offer different type of training methods. Some are more effective than others. So I prefer a self-learning method. I prefer to get the material, articles, the equipment. I do it myself. Others may prefer a classroom environment to learn all of this stuff in a more structured format that makes sense for them. But there's pros and cons with that. Like one has a big benefit over the other. And that is with the level of equipment, basically enterprise equipment. Let's say, for example, you want to learn Cisco's SDN solution using Cisco ACI. Well, that requires the Nexus 9000 series switches. I guarantee you none of us anytime soon is going to be buying a couple of 9000 series switches and APEC controllers for our home lab. I haven't met any person who has done that because it will be extremely expensive. It's just not possible. There's something called an ACI simulator, but it's not the same thing as really getting your hands dirty and learning how to deploy it. So learning about some of the advanced equipment like the Nexus 9000 series, even the 7700 series, or with UCS servers, those really come from the bootcamp classes. That really comes from the classroom environments because you're in the class, you're getting the lecture, and you get access to the equipment and working on the different lab books that they provide. That is the best way to get that kind of experience for some of the advanced stuff. Now, if you want to do self-learning, you got to be very creative how you do that. You got to look at terms of remote labs, and some sites don't do that, some do. Some are very difficult to try to get scheduled, and sometimes their labs don't work. It's very, very frustrating. But again, this is for the enterprise stuff, and it's not much out there. Trust me, I look. It's not really much out there for learning some of those advanced technologies that you're even listed here in your particular comment, Adrian. We try to do things where we can virtualize most of the things that we can learn. So we can, like Riverbed, we can basically download something and virtualize it within our environment. That's more cost effective because we have equipment, we have a VMware environment that we can virtualize firewalls and maybe some routers and things like that. So that's a lot more flexible for doing self-learning. But for the advanced stuff, there really is no effective way besides going to these classroom or bootcamp classes. Now, in terms of learning new hardware that I have never dealt with before and deploying it for a company, yes, I've dealt with that a lot of times. But guess what? All of us will be in that situation because new products comes out all the time and you're not going to automatically go, yes, I know how to configure this new firewall that never came out before. Okay. But the more you configure networking products, like the more you configure switches, the more you configure routers or firewalls, different vendors, it doesn't matter because it's really the same thing in terms of its concepts and its foundation. So like I know how to configure Let's keep it simple. I know how to configure VLANs on a Cisco switch. I was thrown a Netgear project a couple years ago. I know nothing about Netgear, but I knew how to figure it out to say, okay, how do I configure VLANs? How do I configure trunking? How do I configure spanning tree? The concepts are still the same, but how do I do in terms of the syntax, or where in the GUI do I go to make these changes? Once you have done this a lot of different times, it doesn't matter what the product is or if it's new or not. It's just a matter of how you make those particular changes through a CLI or through a web interface. However, you may come across products that you may not have a familiar understanding of that product because it's like a new type of network device. Like if you're doing Cisco UCS, that is something different. It's not hard, by the way, but it is something different than just you configuring a router, a switch, a firewall, a wireless access point. It is a little different. So you got to understand how that works, how to configure it, how to support it. So that's something you may not be really familiar with. So one story that I can briefly share with you was I definitely encountered that years ago with working with a load balancer. And I was working at a bank. We were building out an online banking network, and I was responsible for the design of that infrastructure. So that was a lot of fun. We had high availability, so we had redundant firewalls, we had BGP, we had redundant switches, everything in there. Front-end firewalls, back-end firewalls. But one of the requirements was to have a network load balancer that the servers, that would be load balancing servers. I didn't really have much experience with load balancers, because that was really more of a server thing, and I kind of never needed to deal with that. So this was something new for me, and we were deploying this in the next couple of months. So the question was, how do I learn something that I never really have exposure to before? So in that case, I communicated to management that I do not have working experience with these products. Now, the load balancer that I'm talking about was the Cisco CSS load balancers. And by the way, they no longer exist. Actually, Cisco stopped making load balancers, and that's why we typically recommend Big IP or Citrix for any kind of server load balancing. Anyway, so we had Cisco CSS load balancers, and I communicated that, okay, so we need 2 of them for our production environment because we had a high availability requirement. Great. Let's get a 3rd one that we'll put into our lab, which we have, and that will allow us to do our staging. And that means that we'll configure it for what we want based on the requirements, our servers, SSL termination, everything. And that will allow us to use resources. And I said there's a lot of resources on Cisco's website that I will utilize to configure that firewall. We have Cisco support, so we can always use them if we need to. And they agreed with that. It actually made sense. So we basically bought the 3 load balancers, 2 were for production, but I started working with the one in our lab right away. So I use basically articles on Cisco's website. I looked for configuration examples, and I started with a very basic configuration. Let's keep it very simple. Let's just set up a configuration to load balance 2 servers. And it worked. Then from there, I just added on to it based on the requirements. So they may say, oh, we have this requirement for SSL termination. Great, what's the configuration for that? I found it, I implemented it, we did our testing, great. We did the next thing, and once all that was worked out, I just basically kind of replicated that to the production environment. And that's basically how I got myself familiar with learning about a new product. However, we had another project for deploying a storage network. Now, I was very excited, but I really had no experience with storage, and the cost associated with that project was extremely high. So in that particular case, my company basically brought me and a few other of my colleagues to a bootcamp class on Cisco's campus, learning how to configure the Cisco MDS switch, fiber channel, vSANs, and things like that. We even had a little bit of lab access. And then basically from there, we bought the equipment and we configured it in the environment. So in that particular case, that was different. It wasn't about me just, oh, let's just get another load balancer and I'll figure it out in the lab based on resources available on Cisco's website. This was different because storage was really new concepts, completely new. It's different from Ethernet switching. And plus the cost associated was a lot higher. So it's not going to be like, yeah, you just figure it out. Some environments are like that, but some are not. And for that, they really want us to make sure that we had the experience because, again, this is part of a storage network and doing fiber channel to all of the servers. And we had a storage array. So they wanted me to have the experience with learning how to do that. So in that particular case, it did involve me going to a class and getting that hands-on experience. So my final point about this is it will really depend on the environment. It will depend on the resources that you can get to learn the material. It will also depend on the timetable of when this needs to be completed. If you have a large enough timetable, then you can basically go back to your management staff and say that I need more training on these products to configure them practically in our production environment. You can say exactly like that. And you can reference and get particular training. So if you find a video training, if you find a workbook, if you find a bootcamp class, depending on which method you prefer, then you can get that training. And then from there, you can go ahead and deploy the products based on the requirements of what they actually want. Because once you get that experience, then you will know exactly how you need to get this set up and so forth, okay? But if the timeline is a lot shorter, okay, that means that you probably can't do a lot of effective training of learning about the products, then that's probably where you want to bring in somebody else, like a sales engineer, which Cisco could likely do. They do a lot of that for UCS deployments. Or if you got this from a partner, then the partners could likely be involved and help out with professional services. So that's something that could also happen, but it all depends really from my experience based on the timeline of how soon do you need this equipment to be deployed in the production environment. And we're done with this episode. So if you have any questions about being a network engineer or anything in the networking field, post those questions below in the comments and your question could be selected as one of the new episodes on this channel. So thank you for watching this video. Please like, share, and subscribe. That means a lot. And support us at routhub.net. And until next time, keep networking.